Hey everybody, I'm Sean Robinson.
I'm Carson Grubaugh. Welcome to Living the Line. Sean, we have a special guest today.
We do. Our special guest today is Eisner-nominated cartoonist, award-winning portraiture artist, oil painter, and messer with of technology, Mr. Carson Grubaugh.
Hey guys, thanks so much for having me on, man.
It's good to see you, Carson. So I hear you made a comic with a computer.
Yeah, I know. I'm a sinner.
No, it's true. You are a sinner.
We made
Also,
a
the
comic with a computer.
I did, but we're not talking about that one today. So, yeah, so this video is tied to directly linked from our comic Abolition of Man. So you might be watching this from our YouTube channel, or you might have read Abolition of Man issue number 2. Maybe you're one of those lucky few thousand people who picked it up at your local comic store and scanned that QR code and got to this link here. And so we are going to be talking a little bit today about the origins of the book, but also sort of the origins of Carson, your thought process in terms of futurism, philosophy of information, your fine art. I think it's safe to say that this entire series, the one of the sort of byproducts of it is essentially bringing a fine art context to, uh, I mean, a monthly comic series,
Yeah.
right? In terms of, and when I say fine art context, I don't mean like we're going to hang it on a wall. I don't mean that Thomas Kincaid painted it. I mean that the conceit was the important thing, and although it was executed as well as possible, the conceit and the theoretical framework for it was the exact reason that it existed. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and just like I know people have watched the channel forever, kind of know that I had like a fine art component to what I did over the last 20 years, but we've never really talked about it.
Yeah.
And so it's the book is really related to most of what I was doing for the last 15 to 20 years, in terms of those like philosophical conceits and things that you're referring to. So yeah, it's just interesting that I finally found a way to kind of merge the two things, like the
Mhm.
AI, which anyone who's watched us knows that me and you were really skeptical about,
Yeah.
actually gave me the tools to mix what I've been doing as a fine artist with me really kind of not being too interested in functioning in that world anymore and going back to comics. So it's actually was pretty exciting, even though I'm really skeptical about the tech.
Right. And so we should just take it back just for a second. So when you and I first got, or when you first got into Midjourney, that first image that you sent me, this is back at the very end of no, sorry, the third day of June.
June.
Um, what immediately the first thing that both of us thought was this has got to be a comic. Somebody's going to make a comic about this. It should be you. Right, or it should be us or something along those lines.
Yeah, yeah.
And your first impulse was to think about this C.S. Lewis essay, Abolition of Man. And so this first issue is the first issue, which you guys have probably already read, is entirely sort of feeling out the parameters of Midjourney as it existed on June
Hmm.
3rd through June 5th by giving it a heady philosophical text as the prompt. And so all of the
Yeah.
illustration in a real way was the computer was entirely responsible for, other than you having a mild curatorial context.
Yeah,
But then,
picking out of the four. But that essay was chosen because it was one of the ones that I read when I was in my early 20s that set the course for my thinking about futurism and had a larger impact on my thoughts as an artist and a philosopher than I understood at the time. And I've returned to the essay since then and gone, oh man, like this is where a lot of that came from. So that essay, like, I mean, we got that image and we said, you want to make a comic? Yes, we need to make it in the next 2 days. And then I was like, immediately, I know what the first 4 issues are immediately. And then we got lucky with the fifth by getting Luciano. And I knew that I wanted him as well. I
right.
just didn't know if he would do it or not. But it was one of those situations where the whole thing just like drops in your head, like almost complete. except for issue 3, but we kind of knew that I wanted you to finish it. And issue 2, you say, no, well, I'm only involved in issue 3. I went back and rewrote a lot of issue 2 based on what you did in issue 3. So to me, you still help build the world. So this is your book too, I think.
Well, so essentially we have a philosophical sandwich, and the through line being the title. I mean, once you pick that title, The Abolition of Man, I mean, I can't believe that you had this story for issue 2 readily available at your hand. I mean, that had to have prompted it. I mean, not just the fact that they fit so well thematically, but also the fact that the title itself, I mean, I've thought a lot about that title since then, and I did not quite connect it until a little bit of time has gone by, and it's like that's what we've been doing, like we're responding to the distress that you feel realizing you don't have any purpose.
And I mean, that was like I said, that C.S. Lewis essay was something that I probably read when I was 19 or 20. That's when I first really started getting into philosophy. Before I went back to school, I was going to be a professional comic artist. I didn't ever want to have an academic education. I was always good at school, but I hated it. And I just wanted to draw comics. And so I did that. I went to the Kubert School for half of a year and dropped out, and then came back and just worked full time. Was trying to get jobs in comics. And during that time, I started, mostly because of Alan Moore's Promethea, I started getting interested in philosophy. And that had to have been one of the earliest things I read before I went back to school and got 2 academic degrees, so that
glutton for punishment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I enjoyed every minute of that at the time. It's easy when you're just reading stuff you're interested in. But yeah, I think I probably read that, and that influenced that story that I had hanging around probably got written after I first read The Abolition of Man. But it wasn't in response to it. It was just that was in the back of my head, I'm sure, from reading that essay. But for that story, like the story that's in issue 2 was something I wrote when I was, I believe, 23. I think I was 23 when I wrote that. 22 or 23. I was dating a girl at the time, and I thought it would be fun to because she was also creative, and I thought it'd be fun to collaborate. Like, I would write a chapter and send it to her, and she would write a chapter and send it back. And so I just sat down one night and, like, automatic writing, just wrote. And that's pretty much a mildly edited version of that is what is issue 2. And that story that I wrote, over time, as I keep going back to it, I realize how much I was telling myself about where I wanted to be going as an artist, mostly with the concern about what I wound up in 2013 calling the banal content apocalypse. Not a banal content, but banal content apocalypse. But that story was the first time I wrote this idea of people being in an office, and the guy's just getting, like, papers, and, like, here's an insurance letter, turn it into something, and he rearranges the letters in it to tell a story, was the original version of it. Now I realize the robots could do that, and so that becomes a rule in the book. But that was the initial idea, is just that, I don't know, we're going to have to keep busy, and eventually we'll just sit around. There's no new content, and so we just rearrange old content. And that was the story that I wrote when I was 23. And so that was ready when we're talking about a book. It was like, I've been wanting to return to that story. I've rewritten it a few times just as prose, and thought about it as a comic, and it was like, there you go, that's the AI book, perfect.
And what, in terms of art, were you doing simultaneously with this short story? You're saying
at that point, my art, I was just getting into, like, painting, just learning how to oil paint and stuff. So my art, I mean, I could show some, but it wouldn't really be worth it.
No, that's fine.
Was just just me, like, okay, I'm gonna paint like Gustav Klimt. Okay, I'm gonna try and paint like William Bouguereau. So the visual component hadn't caught up to the thoughts, and I don't think the thoughts were really solidified enough. The thoughts I didn't start writing them in a concrete way until 2006 and 2007, when I was at Berkeley and actually, like, in philosophy classes and having things kind of fed to me to respond to. And I can talk about a couple key moments, revelatory moments that happened at Berkeley that led to some real concrete writing. But and then that tied into the visual art eventually.
Gotcha. And I was just wondering, because I know that you had a lot of engagement with, you know, essentially like consumer art making devices later, even with like, you know, Facebook and things like
Oh
that.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. And we can talk about, we can kind of go through some of those so
yeah, sure.
people get it. Yeah, because I've always been interested in tech and where tech is going, but I can't code or anything like that. Like I've tried to teach myself a few times and I can start to do it and then I just get bored, because it's like, you know, when you're a kid, you can play chopsticks all day, but when you're an adult, you want to get to the project you want to do, and it's harder to, and so that's been my experience. So I've always been really good at taking publicly available things and hacking them for my own purposes,
Right.
I think is what you mean by some of these consumer. Yeah, and we can go through some of that.
Sure. Well, gimme.
Okay, so I can tell you, like this stuff started solidifying at Berkeley, and there was two things. There was a class called American Cyberculture, and I forget who the instructor was, and I just, that, you know, was a real good overview of American cyberculture as of 2005 or 2006. And one of the, no, I don't think it was in that class. And then there was another class that was just like basically, you could say like introduction to conceptual art, was kind of what it was. And the TA in that class, Jaime Cortez, who did an awesome comic that we'll have to look at some point, or I'll have to do a one-man review. He showed us this piece where it was, someone had filmed a carpet and then algorithmically coded so that the more light, the brighter area of the carpet was, it extrapolated tall. And
Okay.
I kind of taught, you can see that in the book. There's this thing where I say, take letter forms and come up
Right.
with a thing and make a building out of them. And I watched this video and I immediately like it just unpacked this whole world of what was gonna be possible to me, about where any one input could become any other input, because the
Right.
algorithm can make a syntactic transformation, and I could take a letter and turn it into a value that could be mapped, or I could assign a number to it, and I could take writing and turn it into an image. And then I immediately was like, okay, we're going to be in the future, we're going to be in a world where I could go into a virtual reality where the patterns of the wind are determined by numerical values assigned to Shakespeare plays.
Right.
Like I could enter worlds that are entirely determined by these rules transmuting previous content.
Yeah.
And that like unpacked in my head in like 30 seconds watching this video, and you can imagine like what kind of fucking experience that is.
Yeah, no, and anybody, if you have overlap with either the visual or recording arts and math background, you hit upon some of these things. Like if you look into fast Fourier transformation, and the first time you use a visual editor to look at like a spectrogram analysis of like a piece of sound, and you see everything laid out, and it's like a seagull looks like that. Like, how in the world did this happen? And it's like some dude named Fourier, before there was a computer, figured out a way to visually represent sound as information, as visual information. And once you learn about these kinds of like mathematical transformations that allow yeah, I mean, data to be analyzed by all of your senses, it's crazy. That's a fascinating one there too. The height as a, or the vibrancy or the luminosity as height.
Yeah,
That's a
luminosity equaling height. So it was like the brighter it was, the taller it got. And so you took a carpet and you just extrapolated like a three-dimensional map out of it. And I said, oh shit, you could turn a carpet into a city.
right.
And then you could put some other parameter of color that's like wind patterns, or, you know, like
Yeah.
it was early 2000s too. So information data visualization was becoming a big important part of how we understood the world at that point. But that, I was already interested in that because the guys like Chris Ware doing like his flow chart type of comics was influential just in terms of data visualization. But that one put the idea in my head that there was an infinite amount, like usually when you're doing data visualization, you're trying to make it sensible. Like you have a context that you're trying to explain. You're trying to explain something to someone and you're trying to visualize it for them. But I realized you could just do it. You could come up with any set of rules and translate one thing into another thing infinitely. And that became like the core of what I did for a long time as an artist. I can show you the very first one I did was in that class at Berkeley. I took the first chapter of Baruch Spinoza's Ethics, which was my favorite philosophy text at the time. I was really convinced and still am pretty convinced by his view of reality. And the first chapter is an argument for the existence of God. And what I did is I just, put the alphabet and the numbers on a Cartesian coordinate, which I thought was funny because Spinoza follows pretty fast after Descartes. And then I just went at 2 letters at a time and I would just map them. So if it was like I would go, okay, I go to A and then I go up to T and I put a dot and then I connect the, and then I go to T and H and find that and I connect them. So I just had these rules because I couldn't program. So I did it all by hand. And it was like, okay. And then I wanted, like, how cool would it be if I did this and like a God face showed up? So let me do CMYK and just alternate, every line. That's, you get a cyan one, then you get a yellow one, then you get a magenta one, then you get a black one, and you just keep that cycle going. And so this was that first chapter mapped out. And I did some other things like that where I used Photoshop, take this text and every 2 letters gives you, like a black value or something like that, and you fill it in. And I did other pieces where, I was just using like every,
That's
like, here's all the
woman. Please go back to the dancing woman. No,
this one.
Yeah. Do you see?
No, I don't see her.
She's dancing. She's up like this.
But see, this is what the AI is doing. It starts like this, and
Right.
then it has computer induced pareidolia, and it pulls an image out of it.
Right.
And that's like, that's kind of some of the things I was thinking about. And this is 2006, 2007. 2007.
So tell me about the generation for that one.
This one would have been, well, this one will explain it better. So this one was all the 3-letter words in the English language assigned a RGB color value. Okay. And I just took, that you have 0 to 256, and then you have 26 letters. So that divided by 26 gets you 9.6. So it basically steps of 10%. So I'd put, like 10%, well, like, if it was then T would have some numerical value, and H would have a numerical value, and E would have a numerical value, starting with, like, E would be somewhere around 50, I think. A is 0, B is 9.6, and then Z is 256. So every 3 letters just generates a color. You just go into Photoshop with the color picker and put in the CMYK value. And then this is every 4-letter word. This is easier because you have 1 through 100, and you just go A is 0, B is 4, C is 8, and that's every 4-letter word given a color. So these ones are using that 4-color CMYK. Okay. A is 0, B is 4. So this is just some body of text, every 4 letters and turning it into a grid. And I was hoping that pictures showed up, but I never saw one in them. Yeah, and I was also doing the reverse of girl. I'm glad you can see something. But I was also doing pieces like this where I was taking an image and turning it into a grid, and then going piece by piece of the grid and writing down the CMYK value. So you basically get, this was a big color by number where you could fill in the pixels basically. Okay. So I was interested in those, like, text to image translations and image to text back and forth. And at some point I realized that there was an ethical component to this, which is how I wound up becoming acquaintance with Luciano, because I realized that I originally thought about this as alchemy, right? Like this is actually, alchemy is magic, but when you understand how the reality is at its most abstract, the lowest level of description is information. Information becomes transmutable. And I wrote a little paper for one of my art classes about this that maybe we'll print in in if we do a collected version or something. But I realized that it's like alchemy. I can take a picture and turn it into an image. And at first I thought that was really cool. But then I realized that you can only make a syntactic transformation. So you lose all the semantic content. And I eventually I found that to be troubling, like ethically troubling. I took gold and turned it into shit. Right? It's semantic gold. It's meaningful, and then I turned it into non-meaningful. I mean, they're still pretty, and there may be. And so then it became my goal to, okay, can I find an algorithm that actually produces some new meaning? I never found one of those, but I imagine you have an infinite amount of number values you could assign. And I really wanted to code like a thing that would go through every possible assignation of a number to a letter and see if there was one that more consistently spit out something that I saw pictures in. And then I thought, well, then that algorithm would have some kind of more universal truth behind it that we could explore, which is probably a crazy idea, but that was kind of driving. And I really had like an ethical, like I was destroying things. And so I worried about the ethics of that, which is something that Luciano talks about quite a bit, the ethics of creating entropy.
It's interesting to me, the numerological aspect of it, both from because of the strange death, but also because of, I mean, you're ethnically Jewish, or your background is ethnically Jewish, right? And numerology and engagement with text as data, as meaningless data, it turns out, is a long-standing numerological, like, ethnical Jewish tradition. Like,
yeah. And I got that from Alan Moore, though, because Alan Moore was playing with that in Promethea. And I got obsessed with the Kabbalah for like the other part of my artistic production over that 15 years was a huge series of paintings that had to do with tarot and the Kabbalah. And I've since moved on from that and think it's all a bunch of bunk, but I took it very serious for a while. So the gematria stuff, gematria is what that's called.
okay.
Really spoke to me. And then I was like, oh, this is part of my own ethnic tradition too. And so that was at the root of, like, I really thought about this as magic when I first started doing it. To me, this was like, oh, there is a scientific explanation for magic now, for the transformational ideas behind magic. Because if reality is, and I still believe this, at root informational, maybe not computational. I think it's also quantum computational, not digital, but then you have mechanisms to describe a lot of the hoodoo voodoo stuff, because you're just talking about shifting around and reprocessing information. You can also talk about objects, like an object like me is kind of no different than a file. Like I'm a set of information, but there's also something that partitions my file off from your file. I become discrete. But files have kind of interaction protocols where you can put information in my head, like we're talking, and so there's like a transfer protocol there. And I really started thinking about that as magic. And then, like, if you could find ways to make those interfaces more permeable, then that's a scientific way to talk about some of the things, or cause transformation. That's a scientific way with information theory, hardcore mathematics to back it up, that talk about a lot of stuff that was in the Kabbalah that interested me. And one of those things was definitely the gematria. And I can show you some stuff where I was using that more explicitly if you want. So this I made a lot of music as well. And you can see here, I'm actually, I was using the Kabbalah, the Malchut Yesod. I was finding their gematria values. So they have a numeric, the Hebrew letters have a numerical value. And then those numerical values add up, which is what you would do with gematria, right? You would add up the numbers. And so like the numerical value for mom plus the numerical value for dad equals the numerical value for baby. There's a lot of that kind of mathematics in Hebrew, which is why it's like, well, this is the language from God. It's a mathematical language or something. So I was getting the full numerical value for that, and then turning that into a string, finding the binary that represents that number, which is this long string, and then basically turning it into off and on for music. So everywhere that there's a 1 is a beat, and everywhere that there's a 0 is a rest. And then they get long patterns too, so you get polyrhythms, which is, as a drummer, has always fascinated me. And then I would like cycle these things on top of each other. So like this here is a bunch of drum music that I wrote from the Song of Solomon in the Bible. And there's 3 different voices in that book. There's like the lover, the loved, and then a narrator. And so the narrator starts it, and that's was a tom pattern. And then the other 3 voices that are in there, and then there's the love's friends. There's like a girl, a boy, and her friends. So one of them was the hi-hat, one of them was the snare, and one of them was the bass. I created a drum pattern and then gave that to a friend to write music. And this was a performance where I worked with a girl in the department who also was really interested in polyrhythms, but visualizing polyrhythms. And so gave her some numbers, and she did like this tape pattern that she came up with that visualized the numerical relationships. And then I had wrote a drum pattern, really into like playing drums into a trance state as well. Like this was I wrote these drum patterns, and then we went into a dark room and shut the lights off, and you can see some of the tree of life written on the floor here. So it was like a big magic ceremony. I was trying to call the spirit of creativity into me. And I was basically using some of my classmates as a circuit board for that energy. But we turned the lights off and we just played drums for like 5 hours straight. We each had our pattern, and we played them for 5 hours straight in the dark. And I did wind up having this wild vision during that time. And I don't get visions, I don't even visualize anything. So that was an intense experience. But that was the gematria that you're talking about. That was very like front and center in that stuff.
Well, and people who are listening to this now who have only read issue 2, I think maybe it's, or issue 1 and 2, I think maybe it's sort of open-ended by the end of issue 2, whether or not what they're doing is purposeful or it provides purpose, or whether or not I guess what I want to ask you is without I don't want to hear you explain to me, whether that's it's true or not for the characters. But do you think that individual purpose making is itself, like the utility that that individual derives from it, is enough to justify an activity? We had a comment on the video with our Dave McKean video where somebody essentially said, well, look, guys, you sound like a bunch of elevator operators complaining when the automated elevator system came in. And he's essentially saying that like drawing and painting and visualizing and creating visual art is the equivalent of pressing a button to decide what floor somebody else goes to. So my question is, let's defend the elevator operator for a minute, okay? Presumably, some percentage of those elevator operators derived genuine pleasure from going up and down all day.
Very, not as many as artists derive pleasure from art, but yeah.
Right. Well, so some percentage.
I think a better analogy is like farmers that got replaced in the Industrial Revolution. I had a friend tell me privately that this is the Industrial Revolution for artists, and I think that's correct. And I said, yeah, but like no one was sad that they didn't have to go plow a field. And he said, no, a lot of people really found their life's worth in work, and built an entire almost religious value system about the value of hard work and labor. And it was hard, but they really found their worth in it. And when that took it away, you destroyed their entire value system. And I thought that's a fucking good analogy for what's going on here. It's not just that it's fun, it's a whole value system that is potentially disappearing in the same way that hard work value system disappeared. And the world's still here, and we potentially much better for the Industrial Revolution overall. So I think people that are making those kind of comments are suggesting like, yeah, your guys' thing is under attack, but the race will survive. Like you're being bleak about it from a perspective of the species, at least. And I think there's validity to that.
So then the the thing that's being posited, at least in this context, is that purpose can be derived from a variety of different experiences or states. Um, you have to assume, at least in the context of the second issue, that some of the characters are genuinely deriving purpose out of the activity that they're doing. Um,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because it's like satirical in one sense, in that we're taking this heavy thing and presenting it in a light kind of manner, but on the other hand, you could sort of take the straight interpretation that this is a genuine thing that they are engaging with and deriving meaning from, by creating new meaning out of old. And your thing about the farmers, that's a very interesting thing. We had a private discussion with it. We were interviewed for something, and there was a longer discussion. And I brought up the fact that when the first like Czech science fiction writers were writing about the future, they imagined that we would all automate things like physical labor and cooking and cleaning.
Hmm.
Uh, and yet, what do rich people do as soon as they have the money to buy anything they want? They all go out and they jog and they plant their gardens.
And they learn how to make sourdough bread. I mean, that was like a big thing during the pandemic when people had time. Like,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and so I'm Dave McKean talked about it's more about the journey, it's more about the process. And this will just like, I know we've been real skeptical about, but it will just put a new process in place. It's just scary for all of us who are engaged in the old process, because I think we understand that the people who care about the old process will care about it even more, but it will
Yeah.
probably be niche, like
Yeah.
anytime you get this stuff, um, like music, people complain about music so shit today. Well, the pop culture stuff has run towards the average, but if you really love music and you really follow music is better than ever. I mean, the level of musicianship is absurd these days. So it's just niche. It's just not, there's not the zeitgeist where, like, we're both 90s babies, but well, not babies, we're 80s
Yeah.
babies, but 90s teenagers.
Right.
And the zeitgeist at that time was that the people doing the experimental stuff were the ones that were also getting popular. Faith No More, Primus,
Right.
you know, kind of being counter pop became the pop thing. Uh, and I think that's gone away and will never come back. But there's still all that kind of music being made. It will never be the zeitgeist. And I think that's, people who actually make art will continue to always exist, but will probably eventually become niche as the AI kind of creates a pop average consumer, but there we'll still have to derive meaning from something. And I think more and more people, if they're able to engage with art by using the AIs, and they wouldn't engage otherwise, and there's something in that process that will be valuable, learning all the tags. Like in that interview with that you're talking about, I talked about like visual and rhetoric kind of studies and things like that. Visual studies programs, I think, will have to become more sophisticated,
Right.
understanding. Like, everyone's going to have to learn what does octane render mean, or what does these terms that people are using to be successful. That's the knowledge you'll have to be a good prompt writer. You'll have to know the history of art. You'll have to know the artist style references and all those kinds of things, but you won't necessarily need to know how to shade with a pencil anymore. It's just a different knowledge set, and that will create a different value system. And I think those of us who grew up in the old value system are freaking out, because paradigm shifts in value are scary as fuck.
Yeah. I shared some of this conversation with someone who I know who is a data manager for law firms and places like that. And the thing that was I think hit him as a civilian the hardest was the idea that any process, meaning making process, can be derived and extracted into a data process. And it's funny that now that I am aware of this as a concept and aware that this is the actual existential dread that I am feeling, it comes from this. I start seeing it everywhere. There is they just announced that there's going to be a remix of the Beatles album Revolver, which needs a remix and has needed a stereo remix since it first came out because stereo was so crude at the time. It's just a horrible stereo mix. It was never intended to be made for stereo. But it was never remixed before because everything is locked down. If you go and you get the master multi-tracks for the first song, Taxman, the first track is drums and bass and rhythm guitar. Well,
all on one track.
Exactly right. And the second track is tambourine.
And then
you
a
see where I'm going
track.
with this?
Yeah.
So you've got weird choices to make, right? But the thing is that the code has been cracked. They were able to demix the individual tracks and split them off into discrete tracks that are of high quality and have no audible artifacts, so that they can be actually mixed into a multi-track master with a realistic stereo representation. And the engineer who pushed for this and developed a lot of the techniques said, well, I figured your brain can do it, so why can't a computer do it?
Yeah.
And and he's right. Like, if you sit down as a musician and you listen to it, your brain can filter out the other stuff, just like you and I can have a conversation in a room full of other people who are talking. If you stick a microphone in that conversation, it's going to sound like a total mess, but you and I can still focus on each other. The same thing with that. You can listen back to it and you can discreetly hear the bass guitar, and you can discreetly hear the drums, and you can discreetly hear the guitar. And if you are a musician, you can pick out each of those parts and you can separate them mentally from each other. And granted,
and recreate them, go play them yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. So this engineer said, well, if that's something that my brain can do, a computer can do it too. And it is exactly AI processing that has enabled them to do it, because essentially what they did is stuff that they had discrete separated stuff for, they would feed that as a training set and then feed it a mono mix, and you do enough of those interactions with this and the machine is able to do it. And basically the only time that in the future that this is going to be a problem is when things have categorical overlap, like you have two pieces of information that are playing in unison or otherwise overlap in frequency range. So like a bass guitar and an electric guitar, as long as they're playing in their own discrete range, it's easier to mentally separate them. And the same thing goes for this algorithm. It's more difficult if they overlap each other frequency-wise, if they're playing in the same pitch range.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I listen to a lot of metal music, and when you get the distorted guitars or the 8-string guitars and the bass player, you already got bass notes. So like I have a hard time hearing bass in a lot of the music I listen to, because and they especially if they play the and the bass is going do 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 do, like it's a little
And the metal stuff, the unison, the rhythmical unison also
a lot of times. Yeah. I mean,
So
I like
all
the
that-
stuff that's polyrhythmic more than the unified stuff, but there is a lot of that, and so it does. Yeah, that would be hard to filter out. But it gets to the idea that we're like, I've seen a lot of people be like, well, this isn't creativity, and to me, it's like, no, this is creativity. We're learning that that's all we are, though. And I think that's the existential dread that you're feeling. Like, that set in after that interview. I said, oh, we're just pareidolia machines. And then I pulled up that thing and you said, look, there's a lady dancing. It's like, that's stable diffusion. That's the process they're talking about. And so when we're learning that we're really not doing much else than that, that's a really unsettling human realization. And I think I had that early on writing that story. I had an intuition of it. I didn't know it. A few years later, I started to formalize it to where I could talk about it, and I had done reading and actually understood what syntax and syntactic transformation, semantics, I had the language to describe what I was intuiting. And then also, like, remix, you're talking about remix, that was a big part of it, because we grew up with hip-hop, and I think that was just in the air. That was something I remember reading an article a long time ago, probably when I was 18 or 19, where someone said, in the future, people will be famous for being curators. Like, they'll be famous for having good taste and making a good playlist, was how they were putting it. And
That's where we're
that
heading.
has definitely become true. Like how many YouTube channels are just like well curated music collections in a certain genre, something like that. I mean, even what we do here is kind of that,
Yeah.
right? Here's some good comics, like,
Yeah.
And people get famous off that. I mean, cartoonists, kayfabe, guys like that, or 70,000 followers or something for
Yeah.
being good curators.
Right.
Also great cartoonists, but
Mhm.
the popularity of the channel's curation. And then now that's what you are with Midjourney, is a kind of a curator. So I saw remix culture. I saw memes as a remixing of content. Like instead of creating new content, we'll just kind of smash old content together and kind of like get extra mileage. So one thing I got a lot of very interested in is how to like pack more information into something through those kind of strategies.
Mm.
Like a meme can pack a lot of information in because of all the prior knowledge that
Mhm.
culturally comes with it. So I got interested in that kind of stuff because I really got bothered by the ethics of making nonsense out of sense.
Mm.
And then I circled that idea from a lot of different angles. Um, and one of the ways that I circled that was in 2011 when I graduated. This was my thesis show at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, and this was called Hode Tech. So this is where the
Mm.
name for the company in issue 2 comes, is that story that I had wrote when I was 23 had continued to iterate itself in my art projects to where I was doing all of these things. And then I imagined, okay, well, that's what the people in that story I wrote are doing.
Mhm.
And, you know, the music and all of these things I was doing. And so then this was from the Kabbalah series that I was doing. And that's the Hode, which is Mercury. And Mercury is the god of like information and language. And he likes to play tricky transformation games. So that was from the Kabbalah series piece that I had. But then I imagined like this office where everyone's sitting there just doing these transformations. And then for the sake of the show, I built my what is now my computer screen and into this custom made desk that I had. I designed it and then I paid someone to build it for me. And that's just based off the symbol for Mercury. And I had the TV embedded in it that cloned my screen. And I just sat there hand doing one of these transformations where I was taking, you know, here you could see these are the numerical values. And then I'd take the next 4 letters and plug them in and I'd fill the grid. And then I'd delete those letters and I'd do the next one. So people could come and watch me do that live. And I had these little business cards that were like Hode Tech, and I like, you know, wanted it to look weird and spocky and futuristic. So I had like got this chair that looked kind of futuristic and wear all white. And I'd make a big performance about every time I finished a line of grid, I would go, you know, move this like corporate map or whatever. I mean, this had a different function in a different project, but I'd go slide that and then I'd go sit down. And so I would just sit in the museum for 8 hours a day doing that. And that was Hode Tech, like, and I imagined a building full of people doing that. And I always wanted to do a museum installation where I had like, you know, 30 of these desks built and just a bunch of people doing this. So you could walk in and see that. And that was 2011
Okay.
that I did that project. So when we got to write the book, I said,
Right.
okay, now we can, you know, I've got Hode Tech, and that's where the line in a world where there's nothing new under the sun, choose to change the sun. That
Right.
was I had a friend record like because we had to have an audio component, like where people could call and listen to an artist statement. And so I wrote this little audio bit, and I had my friend Karina, who had the perfect like you're in a corporate hallway computer lady voice, and she's like, in a world where there's nothing new under the sun, choose to change the sun. But she also like explained the art project, you know, welcome to our Gematrix, you know, we have Gematric analysts who are running mystical processes on ancient text, looking, you know, it's like this whole spiel that they could call and listen to. That was like you called the corporate hotline. So that then when we came to the book, I was like, well, fuck yeah, we're doing that story. You
Yeah.
know, it's finally like in its, well, I don't know. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways that this thing exists, but I feel like this is the most concrete way that it exists.
Yeah. Right. And as there are, existing context changes, I think the relevance or plausibility of it becomes higher and higher. I have worked in an office for a very brief period of time, and found found that to be a fairly harrowing experience. And so, um, all of this is already a kind of horror filled environment for me.
Yeah.
And
Well, and when I wrote it, I was working in medical records, or I had just quit. I had worked in medical records for like about a year and a half.
Oh, so
Um,
you had the experience. That was my other question. Is like, where did this, the the observed details, where did they come from? So what did you do in medical records?
just the file clerk, like I would go in at noon. I was on the night shift. I would go in at noon and I would spend the first 3 hours. They would just give me a big stack of like this was this is before I went to the Kubert. No, this is right after I got back from Kubert. So 2000 to 2002. And right when I left, they started scanning and digitizing everything. But at that time, you'd still get all the doctors made their papers and their secretaries typed up their notes, and then they get sent to us. And then I would have to put them in numerical order because the charts are all numerical. So I'd first 3 hours of the day, I'd put all the papers in numerical order. And then the next, I go to lunch or whatever. And then the next 5 hours, me and a bunch of people would go file them all. So now that they're sorted, we just go through I'd take like the 2000s and I'd go put all the things in their chart. Oh, I'd pull the chart, put the paper in it, and then they would go to these ladies who would actually like put them in the right place in the chart,
Right.
in the right category, pulmonology, oncology, or whatever. And then it was a great job because you'd finish that pretty early. And then since we're on the night shift, I just sit around and draw and read comics and stuff for the last 3 hours. Because the only thing we had to do is if someone came into the acute care, then we'd send their file down. That was it for like from 5 to 9. It was a 12 to 9 job. And from 5 to 9, it was just acute care. And we would go around and pick up the charts from the doctors. That was like a half hour. We'd each take a floor. So that was the office experience.
Oh.
No, go ahead.
There's something about being in the lowest level position of a large organization that really drives home exactly what it means to be part of something that you don't have to understand in order to do it.
Yeah.
If you were like, I mean, I was the lowest level possible person at a giant multinational organization, that you feel like a cell in an organism, because
Yeah.
your fingers, your skin cell or whatever doesn't care about you.
Yeah.
It doesn't engage with you. You as a person who's emptying trash cans at I don't know, Little Caesars headquarters or something. I mean, doesn't have to have any kind of engagement with the whole thing. It's a weird experience if you're the type of person who's prone to that kind of pattern seeking and meaning making, to realize that the thing that you're doing has meaning solely for another creature that isn't even alive in a literal sense.
Yeah, and I mean in medical records there was a sense of like it did have purpose, it was involved in people's healthcare, but that was the absolute most mentally creative. That was like when I started reading philosophy, and that's when my mind was constantly on fire at that point. I also had a lot of panic attacks. So I think part of it is I've been medicated since then. And so some of that crazy like creative energy also gets tamed down by the SSRIs, because part of what leads to the panic attacks is your brain's you're just serotonin transfer all the time, which will make you super creative,
Right.
like always got ideas, but when your brain just never shuts off, you start having anxiety as well. But during that point, I was a crazy person. I would show up and they tolerated me in that. It's funny because Harvey Picard was medical records, and they seem to have tolerated his personality the whole time too. It's a good place for comic people. It's like super low stress. I think it's one of the least stressful jobs, like what top 5 least stressful jobs you could have. Doesn't even exist anymore now, probably, at least in the form I got it. But I would show up and do the weirdest shit just because I was so bored. like I came to work with like a clown wig on and a clown nose, and I worked a whole shift that way, and people were just like, oh, it's Carson, he's being strange. Like I was just going out of my mind, like with creative energy. And I was, like 21, 22. I was starting to read philosophy, which I know is a late start compared to a lot of people, but like my Christian upbringing that I had been raised in was blowing to pieces. I was getting interested in the occult. I was reading philosophy. I was coming into my own as an artist, like in terms of my technical abilities. Um, yeah, and that was all happening within this fucking rows and rows of medical files. And it's a weird, yeah. So I'm sure when I wrote that thing, like that was a huge part of it. Like that feeling that you get when you watch Terry Gilliam's Brazil, of just this weird, surreal, like I don't even remember any of the details of that movie. I just remember the vibe of like the endless corporate hallways and
Yeah.
bureaucracy and the absurdity. I think that was I've always been very sensitive to the absurd, and that was a pretty absurd existence for 2 years or however long I did it.
Well, at some point, if I ever manage to finish Discards and we flip the camera around and you interview me about that, I will tell you about some crazy jobs that you might not have even imagined that they existed.
Well, and
Because
I had a string of those kinds of things too, like washing buckets out at a vitamin factory for 3 days. I sold Kirby vacuums for 2 days. I was like a dishwasher. Uh, and then finally landed on the medical records. And then I
yeah,
started working in frame shops, and that
it,
that became an easy job to get.
the medical record seems like a peach compared to the other types of menial ones, just because you have the downtime, because it's actually dependent on that. I have a ranking in my head of the worst ones, and the worst was definitely when I couldn't stop. When I tested electronics components in the middle of the night, and
Yeah.
that was the very worst, because I had to do it. Had to do it, and I would fall asleep as the machine fell down to freeze the part, and then it would go back up and it would beep when it reset 20 seconds later, and I'd wake up again.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I realized that they were for missiles,
Oh
and
shit.
I stopped doing it
Yeah,
because
that's like the vitamin factory or being a dishwasher. Like you're just at a sink washing dishes for 8 hours and you smell like fish because you're in an Italian restaurant,
right.
or you're just washing vitamin dust out of these buckets and for 8 hours, and there's like this 60-year-old man whose life has fallen to absolute shit, and he doesn't even want to talk to the 20-year-old kid next to him because it's like, you don't know anything, kid. Life is misery, like yeah, those were very short but formative experiences, I guess.
There's an amazing series. I think it's a series of short stories by Suge Yoshihiro Suge's brother, Tadek. I don't know how to pronounce his first name. I'm sorry.
Tadeo.
Yeah, Suge. He worked in a medical office doing janitorial type stuff, and it's unbelievable. The things
Yeah,
that
I don't know. Medical records was a tight job. There's a lot of
well,
times where I think,
yeah, these were not records.
yeah,
This was medical
janitor.
waste.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't do that. I always felt bad for the janitors there, but that job is tight. And like when I started reading American Splendor, I was like, oh yeah, no wonder because it's a cush job. But there's a lot of times where I said I should have just stayed there,
Yeah.
but don't pay very much. But anyways, so that was uh that's like Hode Tech.
Yeah.
But then the abolition of man is actually something that itself that I've done things with as well. Well, you were talking about the publicly available kind of apps. So here's a couple things that I think that I did that also looking back were like really related to this AI. I was taking my friends, I was interested in the idea of um like genetics as information, and that
Mhm.
you could share your genetics. And then I started thinking, well, what if you could like procreate with different types of information? And so I'd like, this was like Facebook was the thing at the time. So I was taking like all of my photos that were in my profile, and then I would go download all of the pictures on my friend's profile, and I would stack them all in Photoshop and just run an auto merge. So this is an example of like a publicly available algorithm, a
Right.
process that has a certain function, but I was like I always abuse them to try and
Yeah.
expose the algorithm, I guess, which is why when we got to dealing with Midjourney, my instinct was to do the most Luddite thing, because that's
Right.
the closest look at you have at what it's doing. So I did these, and these were just like portraits. I mean, there's hundreds of them, 250 something, 274 of them. This is just all of my photos, and in here you can see this person didn't have many photos, so you see me and my Hodtech and all that stuff in there. One of my paintings, and but the ones where they had a lot more photos, it would overwrite it, and I got these like glitch images out of it. So I started with that,
I
abusing
can see
that.
you. I can see you in all of them now. It's really wild.
Yeah, I'm always, it's the same set of images for me, so I'm always right there in the middle. You can see that little grid from the Hodtech thing. I'm always right there. But then I thought, man, I want to take this further. Like, I actually want to like create an entity that is like the offspring of two people's information sets. And so I stumbled on the idea of like mating two Facebook profiles. And that's Karen Conk's Rutabaga High Rung. And this Facebook page still exists. You can go visit it. The page is the art, but there's also every post is its own little piece. And my friend Nick Hardigan, who you met at SPX, he came by.
Right. Yeah.
He was a friend of mine from Berkeley, and so I said, hey Nick, can I use your profile? And then what I did is I just used publicly available like averaging algorithms. Like, one thing is Karen Conk's Rutabaga High Rung is just Carson Nick Hardigan Grubaugh. Just, and I run it through just wordsmith anagram, and that was the first thing that came up. So that's our Facebook, me and Nick, our Facebook profiles had sex, and Karen Conk's Rutabaga High Rung is the baby, and it's got its name by just a publicly available algorithm. And then it started, I started trying to think, okay, I'm an entity, and I got born into Facebook. And like, what's my environment? I'm going to look around my environment and try and learn from my environment. And so I was like trying to be the AI. And this right here is a post from Patch Kientz, a guy I went to Berkeley with, who was a really smart dude. And I slimmed it down, and that's actually the opening speech in issue 3 that I put into Street Profit. Yeah. This is Patch telling me how much he fucking hated Karen Conks. And he had the instinct about this is, this little speech that he wrote is a perfect speech for that guy on the street. So, but that's real. I didn't make that up. That's someone's real response to Karen Conks that I used in the story. But at first, what I did is I just liked everything. Like, I'd get home from work, I'd go to work at Michael's and be a framer for 8 hours, and I'd get home and I would log into Karen Conks, and I would go through the news feed, and I would like every story that came up, and then I would share it. And so like anyone who, and I had just friended everyone who was my friend and everyone who was Nick's friend. And like Karen Conks' birthplace is like, I did like an internet search for like the halfway point between where I live, or where I was born, and where Nick was born. And I used Pandora. I put in all of Nick's favorite artists and all of mine, and then used the recommendations to generate like Karen Conks' favorite music and books and stuff. So every bit of information on there was some kind of averaging out process of his Facebook profile and mine, the information on there. And then it started having to behave. So it liked and shared everything. And really quickly, you have like 500 people that you've become friends with overnight, and now you're flooding their feed. They really hated that. So then I had to tell Karen Conks that it's always good to share, but it's not good to always share, And so then it was like, okay, it's got to do things that are specific to individuals. It's a social network, so you got to make friends. So then I would take two people's, it was just like putting its profile picture, I was just plunking it in, so it was like hanging out with its friends. And then it started, I started taking people's profile pictures, 2 people at a time. So this was Wes, a guy, one of my brother's best friends, and a guy I lived with for a while. And then probably this girl Amanda or something, I don't know. And I would go to this morphthing.com where it's like, what would happen if I had a baby with Angelina Jolie, you know? But you're supposed to click like on the eyebrows, and you're supposed to click in a pattern so it tells how to line the faces up. And I would just click randomly all over, again, using it like an idiot, and then it would mush the two faces together all fucked up like this. So I was then sending, Karen Conks was sending these to people like, this is what would happen if you had a baby with so and so. And I got like requests like, please quit doing this, this makes me sad. Like a guy said, please take that down, especially if you do a mutilated baby face. So okay, we don't like that. And like, here's a response where this is, I think my brother's in there somewhere. And then I would take, if it's someone told me something, I would copy it. And this is, I would go home, and this is a couple hours every night just going through all of this. I'd copy it, put it in an anagram thing, and then spit it back. So like she would say, you know, something, and then it would say this, and it's like, I'm sorry, I don't understand, I don't speak your language. And then that would get anagrammed, and it would be like, you disarrangement urology skip you know. And so it's just these nonsense generative, but it was generative art is what I was doing. And then started using people's names and those letter processes, and I was like creating these GIFs that are like animations of their name. And then there started being like meme making apps. So I would put in someone's name, and it would generate just like some text in like a text generator. And then it would just be like a random image picker, not an image generator. And I just put them together. This is an example of content aware delete on someone's face, and just seeing what it did. Stacking photos and running them through different Photoshop filters. And then I found like, here's another example. They would say nice color, and then it would come back conic roll, you know, anagrams. Then I started finding like Vocaloids that could sing. So I would generate these poems, like you would use someone's name as an acrostic to generate a poem. And then I would put those lyrics in, and you could use their name to generate tones as well. You could put that into a music generator at the time, and it would bing, doom, bam, boom, ba, ba. And then you put it into the Vocaloids, and it'll say, revelation comes to pass. And then I would send it out on people's birthdays. I started doing it on birthdays. So like Ruth Carlton, and then it would be the poem, and then the little generated Vocaloid song. And just for like 3 years, like on the daily, I would do those things. And so that was Karen Conks. And that started generating these fucking glitch images, you know, the content aware delete a face. And in 2016, there was an app that came out. So I had all of those baby images. And then there was an app that, you're not going to be able to hear it, but there was an app that came out that would animate a face talking. And so I was feeding it those pictures, and I was reading the C.S. Lewis essay, The Abolition of Man, because it would only do like 20 seconds or whatever. And so I was syncing the audio up with these baby faces, and I read the whole essay through these baby faces. And it also gives it like this weird, you know, there was some vocal distortion effect that you could put on it. So I did that essay as a video, a recital of it with these creepy baby faces talking. And then I started taking pornography and putting it in the, like, here's one of those face ones I created for Karen Conks. This is that one of Wes that was on there. And I thought those would be cool to make them as paintings. So these are oil paintings. And then I started saying, well, what would it be like if you could like have sex, like you upload it in the computer, and you could have sex without like any physical, like laws of physics, and or like sex on psychedelics or something. You know, I had this like idea of the images are always more gross than how I hope they would come out. They're more like Cronenberg, right? But I was taking those and putting those in that morph thing. Instead of uploading faces, I was just uploading 2 porn images, and then like clicking over the, you know, random pattern and getting these. And now like you start seeing the AI shit, and I'm like, man, I was doing that in like 2016. It looks the same. And these ones here were just these
Yeah.
oil paintings I did. So I was using one of those glitch images from stacking a boatload of images in Photoshop, and I painted it. And this was something from Karen Cox as well. And then this is just taking someone and auto content deleting their face and putting it all together in a composition. And this was like, I think this one I did in 2019 or something like that. So that's where
Yeah.
I was going as a fine artist. And that series for me was called The Abolition of Man, because that was the title for those series of paintings, because I was seeing us being digitized.
Yeah.
And that C.S. Lewis essay you know kept speaking to that for me. So there was like all of that has just been stewing in me, and projects that I think are interesting and that I'm proud of. But it's like a Facebook page. You don't really get famous for that. And so when it came time to do this comic, I was like, oh my God, I get to say all of those things out in public finally.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's also interesting to see the horror that some people reacted to with that, because it's like they're seeing it repurposed and to them leached of meaning or status or whatever. But I mean, that's exactly what Facebook was doing the entire time to them. I mean, every single one of those things that they engage with is scraping them for data, and putting them into a soup, averaging them out, and then trying to sell stuff to them afterwards. So
Yeah, I'll read Patch's full thing because it's abbreviated version of it, because there's certain things like I didn't want to refer to within the world of Hode Tech.
yeah,
But his full statement was, "You may be the Antichrist to a world I cherish as being my land of bread, butter, and nurture." He's talking about meaning, right? Meaning
right,
is our bread, butter, and nurture. You're backwards dealing with generated content and removal from a response to any one discriminated stimuli makes me feel as if darkness is fast approaching. And I wrote him and I was like, well, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, right? Like, I'm not trying to bring this about. I'm just saying it's coming. You are reinforcing a world where the art of presence is faded and underfelt. I fucking hate you. You should be ashamed, sucking up the future like the rest of those social iPad fucks with that fucked internet tube. I should find you, but I don't know anything about you. Because he didn't know it was me. He just knew it was something that added him as a friend and showed up. But that was like a legitimate, I
yeah,
didn't write that as like, part of making this project what I wanted it to be. It was, an intelligent guy. I went to Berkeley with him, and that was his legitimate visceral response to that project. And
yeah,
to me, that's a summation of everything that I
yeah,
was intuiting and feeling, that and trying to sort through. I've always used my art as a way of answering questions. Like, I have the degree in philosophy, and I just don't, I can write, but to me it felt like there was things that you couldn't address purely in writing. Like we've talked about that a few times now, this
yeah,
Plato quote that I like, that a serious man isn't going to write what he really believes because it's
right,
too locked down, and art seems more flexible. And so I always use art as like, okay, well, I'm a philosopher. Before I'm an artist, I'm a philosopher, and the art's just how I do the philosophy, is how I was looking at all of this. But I usually didn't know kind of what I felt about it until I was done, you
yeah,
know. And it's like an experience, like the process of pretending that you're an AI in living in Facebook and trying to mentally solve that as a thought experiment, but an experiential one where you're actually having to do stuff and you're getting live feedback like that. It
right,
teaches you a lot. So, you know, I, yeah, I'm glad. And then Luciano, who we're going to talk to, the whole time I was reading his stuff,
yeah,
because his stuff is all about the ethics of this and the mechanics of it. And I mean, it's a very thorough philosophical system. But I was going to set out to write a philosophy of information when I graduated Berkeley. I thought, fuck, like, I see the big picture of it, but you gotta, like, real philosophy is hard to fill in the details and do it right. And I was like, man, and I started researching it. And luckily I found Luciano's work, and I was
right.
like, oh, he did it already, and he did it better than I could ever do it.
Yeah,
He's like one of the best.
that's a good
And
feeling when you encounter the thing and you feel that relief, feel like, oh, I don't have to write this article anymore. That is a familiar, nice feeling. Like, oh gosh, okay,
And it's not just an article, it's like a
yeah. Well, I know.
lifelong,
Yeah,
and he won't even finish it in his lifetime, philosophical structure that he's built.
right.
That's phenomenal. One other thing for people interested just in the general kind of things that inform this, to follow up on Seth Lloyd's the computational universe, I think is what it's called. There's a quantum, he's a quantum computer engineer, physicist, but he wrote a kind of like armchair physics book that gives mathematical explanations of basically a proof that the universe is a quantum computer,
Hmm.
and that a quantum computer that could compute the universe would be a computer with exactly as many like atoms or whatever, I'm not a physicist, as the actual prediction of what our universe is. Like physical energy would have the same
Very
amount of
interesting.
available energy. So that was another kind of seminal to this like mystic slash scientific kind of combo that was behind a lot of this as well, that people could follow up on.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing all this. And I'm just gratified that we were able to talk about this in a way that kind of explodes some of these things without pinning down the actual meaning and leaving some options for that. But if you happen to have made it all the way through this video, and you live in the U.S., I have a few goodies to send out to the first three people who comment.
And can we say, because this will have come out after issue 1, can we
Yeah,
put out there the golden ticket?
yeah, let's go ahead and do it. Yeah. So there was a golden ticket in issue 1. We slipped in, how many we ended up doing? Was it 10 copies?
I don't know,
Uh,
you printed them.
I think it was 10 of an entirely different alternate version of the first issue that was made by Dali 2 instead of Midjourney.
Hmm.
And it is very interesting if you have both copies. It's also boring as sin. It's very interesting to see the two side by side and get to compare them. And 10 people will have gotten, instead of doing an alternate cover, we did an entire alternate issue, and it's getting
It's the same cover with a different interior.
right.
So I don't, is that a first? Are we the first people to do an alternate interior? uh and so the hope is that the cover's the same, so they wouldn't even know they got it until they got home. And then on the inside, Sean wrote a little bit about, hey, you got the you got the Dolly variant. We understand after putting it together that the Dolly variant fucking sucks, and the Midjourney version is awesome, so please write us and we'll send you the good one. But there's 10 of them, and that's it,
Yeah.
that exist in the wild, that are like just comparison copies, because I think it's
Yeah.
really instructive to see how very different they're. Two different artists, basically,
Yeah.
different styles, different approaches to interpreting the exact same prompts.
And
um
we included a download code for the variant in the first issue as well, so you'll be able to get a screen version to take a look at if you want. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And so yeah, there are advantages to doing monthly comics, and we're going to try to see if we can find some of those things and surprise you all in the
yeah,
future as well.
yeah,
So
these things that maybe haven't been done yet
yeah,
excite us. Yeah, and I think that's part of the, just even though we're so skeptical about the AI stuff, it hadn't been done yet. And
yeah,
then like just especially for me with all of my background, it was like, oh, we can be the first to do it, and we can do it right.
right,
Like not just gimmick, but say something legitimate with
yeah,
it. Um, but yeah, I am very much, that futurist in me, which is a very bleak and apocalyptic but infinitely interested in the future, is always interested in novelty and what hasn't been
hmm,
done yet as well. And so it's
yeah.
fun. I'm really grateful to have a publisher who's like right there, wants to do all of that, playing along with
And is
it.
willing to just say, hey, let's find out and see what happens, right?
Yeah, it's
So
fantastic. So
yeah, well, it's been great working with you, Carson, and thanks for taking the time to sit down for the interview today.
thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Links. Instagram, buy some stuff, more books at some point. And then issue 3, get issue 3 because it's an awesome. I kept that original collaborative thing that I wanted to do that never happened with this chick. And Sean finished my story for me. And the things that Sean put in issue 3 really impacted, and I went back and rewrote a lot of stuff in issue 2 as well. So I look forward to hearing your story about where your seed for issue 3 came from. And that will be a video that accompanies issue 3.
Awesome. We'll see if we can get somebody to argue with us too. Maybe invite a couple people.
Yeah.
On them. Awesome. All right. Take care, guys.
Later.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.